Thank you very much, Gosh, for the invitation. I struggle to pinpoint exactly where I am on this complex cartography of labels. And it strikes me that we're living in an era where labels and categories are both the norm, as well as the center from which increasingly the center of gravity is shifting away. So that's another way of saying, basically, I don't want to pigeonhole myself, but if I am asked to summarize who I am, I'm a political theorist. I'm a geopolitical strategist, and I'm currently in the process of finishing off my DPhil in politics at Oxford, as well as someone who's interested genuinely in the intersection between public policy, questions of normative ethics, and finally, the rise of nascent technologies, and of course, all of these forces implications on geopolitics in particular. So that's who I am, and thanks for having me on your podcast.
The pleasure is all mine. We're going to dive into everything that you've said, but talk to me about some of the institutions that you've helped set up and also your entrepreneurial pursuits.
Well, absolutely. I had the fortune, if there's one thing that I must claim to be my so-called crowning achievement, of which I'm proudest really, and relish the most going forward, having been involved in its seeding stages, it's the Oxford Political Review, which I have to be very clear about. It's not a solo effort. It's a publication I co-founded with many a good friend and a comrade on a way of knowledge inquiry on a road here. And the Oxford Political Review is essentially, this publication that's an independently edited and independently managed entity that aims to bridge the gap between theory and practice, comprising largely Oxford alumni and postgrad and undergrad students, but we have no affiliation specifically with any particular academic institution, which grants us this unique sort of best of both worlds. You see that we've got one foot through the Oxford door with all of our editors being from Oxford, and yet on the other hand, we are also independent from any and all broader institutions, which allows us to have that editorial autonomy and capacity to pursue what we take to be relevant, in-depth and erudite inquiries into knowledge issues and topics of interest to a wider audience beyond just the Oxford neighborhood and community. So that's essentially what OPR is about. And I'm so glad that I've been fortunate enough to meet these many learned and wise friends who have helped this publication flourish and rise from just a fledgling institution 4.5 years ago and morph into what currently is, which is I would say a team of 30 to 40 highly ambitious, impressive, and committed individuals devoted to making academic ideas and quality discourse genuinely accessible for all. So that's essentially the OPR story. And I can also go on to, of course, Polemics, which is another initiative I'm very excited about. It's a platform, a Web3 platform that aims to transform ideas into concrete tokens that one can support, and through expressing one's backing for these ideas that are produced by intellectuals, leading thinkers around the world, and engaging with them across a multitude of dimensions, whether it be in purchasing it and literally providing financial support for the intellectual with the idea, or engaging in debate and interlocution with the said intellectual, sparring them on their own turf, or finally the dialogue and the wider communication that this facilitates through the unique proof of support concept or proof of support token that undergirds our platform. These are all ways by which we're trying to, as an initiative, as Project marry Web3 with the world of speech, debate, and ideas, and provide a genuine channel, for us to cut through the silo of polarization, to cut through and break down the barriers of echo chambers, and ultimately employ Web3 technologies and decentralization, of which I'm sure you're most familiar, given your wonderful track record, to do something good for society, to really try and ameliorate the problems of mistrust, of cantankerous, rancorous debate, so to speak, that we hear in the mass media. That's not debate. It's just atrocious debasing of debates. And I know that as someone who's taught debating and public speaking for years, we're not getting the sort of ideal deliberative democracy and communicative dialogue in a world today. So what Polemics is trying to do is to say, hey, instead of rewarding you for speaking to your echo chambers, we want to reward you for convincing the other side, for persuading people to see value in your cause, for expressing and channeling, or transforming rather, your intellectual support of an idea into actual resources that the said intellectual could use to advance and drive forward their idea. And that's how polemics, I suppose, was conceived of. And I now serve as its editor-in-chief and also previously head of Asia. So I moved on to a more global post. That's my entrepreneurial pursuit. The final aspect of my work I'd like to touch briefly upon, and I don't want to hog too much time because I'm conscious of, of time, really, and time is of an essence, is I'm a geopolitical strategist. And part of what makes this job so exciting is that I don't need to necessarily work that many number of hours a week. And indeed, I tend not to do that during term time because I've got so much on my plate in Oxford. And I teach and do all of that. But in wherever is possible, I spend the remainder of my time looking at tectonics and geopolitical trends and the events unfolding around our world. And I ask three questions. Firstly, what exactly is going on? So the interpretive question and a diagnostic question. Secondly, what is likely to happen? The predictive question, for which I don't have a crystal ball, but I certainly hope I can provide some perspicuity and clarity as to gauging the next steps and how markets move, how economies are likely to behave, also how governments, the interactions and frictions between different governments and according to geopolitical incentives, how that's going to play out over time. My job really is to dispense advice and outline my broad diagnosis and prognosis as to what's going to happen next. And the final part of my career and portfolio here is to offer advice, to offer prescriptions, suggestions, recommendations for multinational corporations, for high net worth individuals, for investors, but also more generally speaking for folks who are just trying to get some semblance of certainty and clarity. It's very hard to get certainty, but it's less difficult to get clarity. And yet I would note that clarity is important, not just because it allows us to unlock certainty in the long term, but also because in many ways, what we see in a world today is simplistic, reductionist, but yet unclear answers. And that's what we have to push back against. Sometimes what's clear could well be complex. You can have clear and complex answers and solutions as opposed to, parsimonious and clear solutions. And between clarity and parsimony, I would always go for clarity because the world is not as simple as people would like it to be, or as populist politicians would often try and convince us of, the veracity of, right? The simplicity of the world is not a given. And if anything, those who try and oversimplify the world down to something that is just a skeleton and a skeletal framework, they're the voices against which we must, guard the most, really. So I guess that's a broad summary of the work that I've been doing. And as you can see, I straddle, a multitude of areas. You've got the journalism and the media. You've also got the Web3 and technological and digital in that, and the impacts of that on speech. And thirdly and finally, last but not least, the geopolitical advisory services, all of which are tied up with, of course, the core bulk of my academic interests, which revolved around, as you guessed it, questions of injustice under colonial regimes, injustice under authoritarian regimes. Now, you're a philosopher, and I'm sure you'd know when it comes to questions of injustice, is the existing literature in both moral and political philosophy is quite sparse. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm not just trying to be an entrepreneur in a literal financial business sense of the word, or in a geopolitical sense. I'm also trying to be an entrepreneur when it comes to ideas, and through the ideational entrepreneurship that I'm undertaking, provide myself and the world at large with the ammunition and resources to unlock more opportunities and possibilities through nascent technologies, through communicative dialogue and platforms, above all, really, through pressing and challenging what we take for granted and take to be conventional wisdom, one step at a time. One step at a time is a motto by which I work. I'm not a sort of hyper idealist. If anything, I've often been criticized for being very conservative and a risk averse in the way I calibrate my steps. But I suppose that's also how I've managed to, I wouldn't say succeed, but certainly juggle all of these different hats at once so far.
Yeah, you've done a remarkable job of one, nurturing your interests and then actually taking concrete steps to translate those interests into a viable career as an academic, as an entrepreneur, as a thinker. I want to start from the beginning. How did you get interested in all of this? You're, of course, a Rhodes Scholar, so I imagine you were always a good student. But talk to us about how your interests developed and how those interests started becoming hypotheses, and how did you test those hypotheses and then carved out these very interesting paths?
That's a great question. But if I could challenge you or push back against one sort of undergirding assumption you had there, my friend, it's that you seem to have this functionalist, or rather, should I say, excessively generous assumption concerning my career thus far, that almost accords to each and every step I've undertaken, this level of intentionality that frankly I wish I'd had when I undertook these steps. In other words, it's almost like, you know, we're listening to Frank Sinatra and we're trying to rationalize my way and to carve out this claim that there's a my way and the best way. But unfortunately, or fortunately, thanks to the beauty of life and its vicissitudes, I've never really seen my life as one that's charted and mapped out so cautiously, you know, in a means that you could string together using a monolithic narrative or linear narrative. If anything, my life has constituted a large number of ups and downs, of hiccups, of setbacks, of ebbs and flows, of successes and failures. But then that's, to me, that part of what makes, you know, life this scintillating and also transformative experience. It is the lack of predictability, the capriciousness of, okay, maybe not, the mercurial nature of it, right? That makes it so scintillating. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's capricious, because that's probably overstating it. But to answer your question then on a more grounded level, as opposed to, you know, batting on.
Before you do that, I just want to say that makes you more interesting. And I ask this of all my guests, because I feel that interesting careers are as much a product of experimentation and serendipity and ebbs and flows, as you talked about, and
I like
making a fool out of yourself.
Careers, you know, I like the S.
Yeah.
And
then we learn through the process. And as a friend of yours, I know some of that. So that tell us the background story.
Exactly. And before I launch into, I just want to say, you know, Utkarsh's book, right, on essentially this world of side hustles, this era of side hustles, it reinforces and also feeds back into a point I've been making all along, that we're living in an era where, yes, there's increasing casualization of work, but the flip side to casualization is emancipation. Right, and the rise of this slasher economy, and also the lack of, I guess, stability associated with occupations, you can see it as a downside, but you can also spin that and view that and seize upon that as an upside, because it grants you more freedoms to choose and more freedoms to maximize and create your time in a manner that generates the most utility for not just others, but also yourself. So yes, this is an era where labor is increasingly precarious, where mechanization, automation, and of course the proletarianization of labor are very much ubiquitous trends. But what I want to emphasize here is that we can fight back. We can reclaim our agency. And that is through leveraging exactly Utkarsh's, you know, incredible adages and maxims concerning side hustles, and also making yourself useful to more than one party, more than one stakeholder, in order to really, you know, seize upon the times are in and turn the uncertainty into certain flexibility. Anyway, that's just me being a quasi-life guru, not particularly convincing. But I've been reliably informed I'm not a convincing life guru because of my age. And to which I often note that actually, I think the age of those who point this out, I mean, that's a discrediting factor against them as well, given the huge volumes of nascent technology. So let's not engage in ageism there, because true Kwok could actually backfire. But anyhow, moving back to the question you asked me, look, I started off being someone who'd always valued hyper-perfection. I was a hyper-perfectionist when it came to grades, okay? Excel in exams, smash all the courses, get all the A stars you need in GCSEs, and move on to topping out IB, which I did. And yet there was always this part of myself, really, that from a young age I'd realized there was more to life. I wanted more in life, at least, but I couldn't quite put a finger or a word or sense of cognizance to it, right? It was more like, yes, I know I want more, but what is that more, right? It's one thing to know what you have is not enough. It's not to know what exactly you need. It's almost like when you finish the 2-course meal or 3-course meal and you're waiting for the pudding menu, and you know you need a pudding, but you don't know which of the puddings you actually fancy and desire. Okay, that's a weird analogy. But basically, you know, my moment of awakening really came as a result of the events unfolding in my city in 2014, when the city at large was thrown into and embroiled in unprecedented political upheaval and turmoil over its trajectory, over its future, and of course its relationship with its own country at large. And all of that, skipping aside all the boring politics and diagnosis stuff, what I came to realize was that there's more to life than just getting good grades and succeeding with very narrowly defined traditional metrics, of success. There's also public service. There's also this giving back to the community of which you clearly and I clearly identify as a constituent, as a member, and as a fellow walker. And at the end of the day, that was also when I came to see through my public speaking and debating ventures beforehand, that there was a use for all that I cultivated over the years and how I talk, how I thought, and how I interlocuted with others. And that was to contribute towards a better, more accurate and pragmatic understanding of politics in my home city, my home, Hong Kong. And from then on, of course, that interest in public service and interacting with the complex feasibility constraints and navigating that quagmire, that was a modus operandi that I tried to and really did seek to harness over the years in Hong Kong. But then beyond that, I branched off into looking at other countries, other societies, other peoples that each had their own stories to tell, their own lived experiences and their own bottlenecks and constraints when it comes to politics and economics and geopolitics at large. And that's what piqued my interest in Chinese politics at large, trying to understand what's going on in my country, and B, global geopolitics, right? And making sense of, competitions between countries, between geopolitical interests, between ideologies. Is it actually the case that we're living in an era where authoritarianism is experiencing a showdown with democracy? Is this an era where we've reached the end of history per Fukuyama or per early Fukuyama, because it's changed his mind since? Yeah. Or are we instead living in an age where, because of the increasing pluralization and diversification of power orders and centers in the world, we must necessarily come to grapple with, lack of consensus, conflicting and divergent preferences and ideas, countries that don't get along, geopolitical tensions, if not indeed downright warfare. So my interest in these topics, I'd say, and now that I'm looking back at it, in this almost sort of Straussian narrativization or reconstruction of my own life, right, thus far, it's almost like I want to see and I want to reach for the stars when it comes to the aspirational ideals, but also grapple with and ensure that we can implement these ideals in real life. And because of my interest in that and preoccupation with that in a personal setting, my own home, I then branched off into trying to do the same to make sense of the gap between the ideal and the non-ideal, the normative and the empirical, and finally, the monolithic assertions we often hear broadcast in superficial analyses, and the complex pluralism exhibited by the patterns and the contours of reality in which we were populated and situated. That's what got me thinking about Chinese politics, international relations, questions of colonialism and post-colonial justice, authoritarianism and what it means to truly reform and take down even authoritarianism. So it's not so much a sort of premeditated linear narrative, like I've got a plan, I'm going to execute it, I'm going to see to its fruition. And more, I suppose, intuitively, subconsciously, there's always been these impulses driving and propelling me forward. And now to look back at it, maybe thanks to your question, I'm beginning to see some sense. It's almost like when you take enough number of steps back from painting, when you're far enough between you and a painting, there's enough distance, that's when you start seeing the painting for what it is, as opposed to merely a part of what it is, right? It's a classic blind men with the elephant hypothesis. We'll try our very best to feel and touch the elephant. Very often we only end up with one part of the elephant. But when you take a step back, okay, maybe not in the case of a blind man or blind men, but when you take a step back and I guess you can use ChatGPT to scan the elephant or something, then you'd be able to see the elephant in its whole. And that's also how, I think autobiographies, the best autobiographies are written. They're not written as justifications. They're not written in a selective manner to cherry pick, but instead written in an organic manner of self-discovery and also gradual exposition via revelation, self-revelation. Yeah. So those are the best autobiographies in mind. Anyhow, I digress. Apologies.
No, thank you for reflecting on this tricky question. I think your response would be very helpful to people in the liberal arts, but also entrepreneurs, because you're straddling both paths. And the biggest insight for me was that you figure out what you want to do with your life progressively. You have to nurture your interests and be really objective about where that's guiding you. And once you understand the problems that interest you, you got to start connecting the dots. And time helps, perspective helps. And I feel that Brian, as somebody who's done quite well at almost everything that he's tried at and failed at many things, this would be, an important piece to keep in mind. So now you've developed interests, you've started connecting the dots. Tell us a bit about, the new world order that's emerging right now. And how do you, as a student of history, politics, philosophy, how are you seeing it? What does that mean to you?
Thank you very, very much, Sam. That's a huge question, And whenever I'm asked to speak of the world order, the way I would like to characterize, or rather preface my answer, is to flag that throughout human history, the world order has never been a static entity. It's dynamically evolved, and it's dynamically involved in three senses. The first being essentially the number of centers of power, okay? You've got unipolar worlds, bipolar worlds, multipolar worlds, and also G0 worlds, right? And these are all possible manifestations. G0, by the way, is an Ian Bremmer coined phrase, I believe, as far as I'm aware. And there's no set or no particular reason to think that any of these modus operandi or vivendi really is the best means, the only means, or the end to which or towards which history advances and marches. The second question, of course, is who, right? So you had the Greek Empire, the Hellenic Empire, the ancient Egyptian civilizations, okay, in the Levant and also North Africa, the Incas, the Aztecs, but in China, right, this dynasty, the civilization, the Chinese civilization, which is often, by the way, taken and co-opted by politicians these days to justify this view that China somehow is a historically contiguous entity that lasts for 4,000 years. I don't buy that argument, by the way. I think there have been many disparate Chinas, disjointed members of China, constituents within China, or Cathay, or whatever name we could coin for it. And it's impossible to track down and pin down exactly this continuous and uninterrupted flow of the Chinese civilizational logic. But that's an aside. Look, it's throughout history we've seen different identities to these different poles, and that's part of the beauty of history. It is eclecticity and unpredictability. And of course, and this ties me on to the final point, of course, one could say, okay, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? I don't know who said it. I forgot who said it, but it might also just
Mark Twain, I believe.
Mark Twain said it. I suspect Mark Twain didn't actually say it. It's likely to be one of those random quotations that misattributes were deliberately malattributes. But anyway, when we think about history and the patterns of history, the third question I always ask is, what are the events, by which history changes and shifts? And you characterize these events in a form of critical junctures. So you break down in theory, for one view, history into a series of basically contiguous flows interrupted by punctuated critical junctures. Or you could argue that history is merely an aggregation, a conglomeration of lots of forces in this chaotic and also stochastic manner. Okay, again, it's unclear if this force wins out, right? The individual winning over the societal, the collective winning over the individualistic. Who's to say that one would always win over the other? There's no set, hard and fast rule, and the important role of chance can never be overstated. Okay, so that's one element, I suppose, of the third question. But the other dimension, the other way of approaching the third question is to say, well, you can look at history through lenses of class, resources, ideas, cultural capital, religion. Right? These are all different paradigms that are individually valid as ways in allowing us to interpret history. All of this is to say that when I ask these three questions, I'm not just trying to, confuddle you, right, or to overcomplicate questions, but instead I think it's imperative to ask, what exactly do we mean, and are we trying to say here by changing world order? For instance, right, we now have a newcomer joining us called Raghav Sharma, and it's a bit like, my surprise is a bit like America's surprise towards China's rapid rise. or alternatively, Britain surprised at America's rapid rise post the War of Independence, right? Raghav, sorry for comparing you to China. If you take offense at that, well, I'm sorry. If you don't take offense at that, then you're a good lad. Okay, so what I'm trying to highlight here is that history is indeed a conjoinment of forces, of actors, and of arrangements between actors. And the new world order we live in today, as I see it, is an increasingly bifurcated world of global bipolarity coupled with regional multipolarity. And yet there's also a high degree of both literal overlap and also convergence in interests, interactions, individuals, and resources. And by that, underlying that, you can then highlight economic, financial, and all these different types of resources here. But there is a zone of convergence, and there's multiple dimensions of interest, preference, and also interaction convergence. And yet at the end of the day, we are shifting towards a more bipolar world than at least 30 years or 20 years ago. And the forces that contribute towards that are multiple, okay? So the reason why we're seeing, almost this Western sphere, and then also this cynic and Russian sphere, and then finally, of course, non-aligned players, right? Or players that claim to be non-aligned, but are actually forced to take sides. The reason why we're seeing this new world order emerge from the ashes of the old are, I would say, there's probably 5 different explanations really for this new world order. The first being, of course, this rising and growing inequality and divide between the havers and the have-nots. And that applies not just to the West, right? We often hear these convenient narratives that say, oh, the West is very unequal, capitalism has fallen, capitalism is failing. But look at inequality in Africa, and then also Latin America, and countries in the global south are also enduring their own gilded ages, where the rapid developmental pushes led by and spearheaded by a very select crop of minority elite at the very top have not led to the percolation of dividends and accruing of these dividends to people on the ground at the bottom. Okay, so you're also seeing that 1% or 0.5% versus 99.95% cut and divide widening in vast rates of developing countries. In China, right, reform and opening up did miracles for the country. It salvaged and rescued from the brink of utter economic failure and collapse. And yet it also resulted in substantial inequalities, where officials and then later on private entrepreneurs, tycoons, property developers amassed vast weights of wealth, and where the lower middle class and the working class struggled. And that's also why President Xi Jinping, for instance, said and made common prosperity a core part of his governing mandate in his second term in office. Like, rightly or wrongly, this is the stated intent and the mission, and this reflects a broader underlying problem that is clear in China. Inequality is no better in Southeast Asia, where despite the affluence accrued from resource exploitation and sales, as well as, of course, cheap manufacturing, especially in the aftermath of rising labor costs in China, all of these are forces that have indeed created a middle class, a burgeoning middle class in Southeast Asia. And yet that has not resolved the underlying problems of distributive inequalities and inequities within the political systems. Even though you have nominally and substantively even democratic structures in Southeast Asia, many of these countries are also dealing with rampant and radical inequalities of their own. So the first force that's contributed towards this new world order, Cash, in my view, is indeed the widening divide between have and have not, which temporarily, was ameliorated somewhat, and after the local maximum and peak in 2013, 2014. So there was declining global inequality for around 5 years to 6 years or so. But then, what happened, right? The Sino-American trade war started roughly 2018. Terrible in terms of supply side and cost push inflation for some countries, pretty harmless and in fact benign for other countries that benefited from the redirected trade from America. But then it was really in late 2019, early 2020 that the world was plunged into chaos, COVID. And this brings me on to the second force, really. The second force exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, e.g. force 1, but it also, meant, and this second force being, of course, pandemics, right? COVID specifically. It also meant that there was an acute and very pressing impetus for action on the part of governments to do 3 things. 1, securitize, right? Securitize the supply of core vital medical resources and supplies. aside from China and America, the few countries that actually leverage medical aid and resources to export and to, I guess, promote their own diplomatic objectives, a vast number of countries genuinely doubled down upon in the first year and year and a half of the pandemic upon ensuring that there would be enough domestic supplies of medical support and medical aid for their own citizens. So there's securitization of essential resources, which led to down the line this awakening to the need of, or this reflection upon, the security of supply chains at large, right? Of strategic industries, of goods that are vital to the maintenance of society at large, not just medical, but also electricity, also water. Okay, and I'll get on to food security and water security in just a second, because that probably belongs to point number 3. Anyway, I'll cast that aside for now. So the first effect of the pandemic is securitization of essential resources, and also doubling down upon thinking about me as a country, me as an individual, me as a government responsible for my people as opposed to the whole world's people at large. The second consequence of the pandemic is that it most certainly created further room for mistrust and skepticism between leading powers, right? But China framed this, especially through state propaganda, this pandemic as the consequence of Western laboratories, and where the same conspiracy theories, the same level of unverified and mind-numbing, impetuous subscription to these conspiratorial theories was replicated in America. And worse yet, this pandemic brought out the worst in many parts of the world, right? Where persons of color, especially East Asians or individuals that resemble East Asians, have been targeted, have been centered and deemed the other, and with the otherness all the more particularized, previously, later, now manifest, okay, otherness. Then this is a consequence, again, of this rising skepticism and cynicism we see between countries and between peoples. And what's really saddening here is that whilst we could have previously said prior to 2019, at least, Sino-American tensions were largely a matter between politicians, these days we can't say the same. We've seen a spillover of these tensions into not just technology or medicine or public health or these areas of economic and financial interactions, but also into civil society interactions, and how academics, scholars, practitioners, theorists, writers from both sides of the Pacific are engaging with one another. So that's the second consequence, in my view, of the pandemic, this exacerbation of a pre-existing geopolitical fault. The final consequence of the events there, and this is also where the glimmer of hope arises, Quaid, the engine of the New World Order, is I suppose there's an awakening amongst many smaller and medium countries around the world that they can't lean on and rely upon purely big countries to provide cover for them. ASEAN solidarity and unity has improved as a result of the resource run and shortages induced by the pandemic. The EU's become more united, okay, thanks to recognition that, in fact, a redistributive mechanism where the wealthiest and the most well-off countries cover for and support and lend a helping hand to those that are in need and deprived at times of crises. This is not just a moral imperative, but it's also in the long run beneficial to all countries involved, because when you contain a pandemic in one country, you also contribute towards containing a pandemic within the region at large and within that bloc at large. So these are the 3 consequences of the pandemic, and that's a second driving force behind the New World Order. So just to recap, we've talked about inequalities and the populism that's resulted in. We've talked about the pandemic as this sort of black swan, and I suppose you'd almost say it's a Dragon King event, right? I'm just quoting here Didier Nonetta, who coined that phrase concerning Dragon Kings, as I've been reminded recently on my LinkedIn. These are both in key events defining the 2020s. But the final force I want to highlight before I let you resume your wonderful hosting and moderation is this. For the 30 years after the Cold War, history hadn't ended, but at least for the developed world, my thesis is that geopolitical contention and ideologically fueled conflicts with a major rival had subsided, okay? So there was no USSR, that's gone. And yes, you had, of course, Al-Qaeda, terrorists, ISIS after that. But at the end of the day, radical Islam, or rather extremist Islam, is not representative, of course, of Islam at large. So this whole civilizational hypothesis, or hypothesis of clashes of civilization that Huntington had concerning, the Islamic civilization versus Western civilization, I don't personally subscribe to this as being applause for its nation for terrorism, because to me, terrorism reflected a more fundamentalist, narrowly defined, and also bigoted ideology of political violence that exploited the name and shell of religion to carry their own end goals. And at the end of the day, the developed world, Quader West, hadn't really met someone or an existential, rival and competitor that could potentially offer an alternative ideology that resonated with enough people, okay, to take on its stronghold and chokehold over the world up until the past few years. And rightly or wrongly, we've seen the emergence of, over the past few years, precisely that. The geopolitical rivalries have once again returned, whether it be, Russia, which has waged an illegal, unlawful, and immoral, in my opinion, war against an independent sovereign state, Ukraine, or the rise of India as a country that's open to working with the West, is clearly emphasizing that it is a part of the West in many ways when it comes to economic and also strategic interests, and yet has its own cultural and religious norms and is still engaged with Russia as we speak. In fact, I think it bought an import of 32 times more oil this year as compared with last year. Sorry, last year as compared with the year before. Sorry. Or indeed China, right? Where many in the West, they could be right, could be wrong, see China as a fundamental challenge to the West-led order. And in my opinion, China could well be. China is not necessarily one, but it could well be a challenger and a most serious contender and challenger to the West-led order, just as Japan was in the run-up to the 1980s, right? As a core technological competitor and rival. In fact, Japan was, if anything, way more ahead of China comparably in the sort of curve, so to speak, of competition with more advanced technology relative to the West at the point of the 1980s or mid-1980s, closing, or it was capable of closing the economic gap far more quickly than China back then in the 1980s. And above all, of course, right, the Japanese people were in many ways as impressive as, right, the Japanese people were in many ways as impressive as the Chinese people as we see today. So all of this is to say that the third force, as I see it, is the rise of geopolitical contenders and rivalries to the global norm. And I'm not saying, I'm not imposing my value judgment here. So I wouldn't say, oh, this is great. It's amazing that we have alternative systems. Nor am I saying that, oh, this is awful because the West should leave. Instead, I'm merely stating the obvious, that this is an empirical fact and we have to grapple with it, right? Rightly or wrongly, this has produced direct geopolitical tensions in the context between two major powers already, okay? One major power and one middle power that's backed by a very large supranational alliance. I'm talking about the war in Ukraine, okay? But it's also produced trade wars and financial warfare and rivalry between Beijing and Washington, and that's been ongoing for 6 years. So these are the three forces that have culminated at this broadly bipolar and bifurcated, but at the end of the day, a more regionally diversified and decentralized world order that we see today. And yet I remain cautiously optimistic that in face of global existential threats and challenges, we have to cooperate. And politicians, or at least I hope enough politicians, are cognizant of that going forward into the future, which is why, for all intents and purposes, let's hope that the tethers of cooperation and the limited zones of convergence and alignment would remain intact, despite the onslaught of all of these other treacherous calamities and conditions. I'm aware that I just gave a 15-minute rant there, so I'm sorry.
It's not a rant at all. I think these are three grounded mental models that will help our listeners understand your perspective on the world order. I'm conscious of time, but I do want to cover a few more questions before I let you go. The first is reflection of technology in the world order. As somebody who runs or helps run a Web3 enabled debating platform, teaches debating at Oxford and Eton and places like that. Are you seeing something on the ground among your students, among your peers, where you feel the technology and these communities that are getting formed with the help of technology are changing the way we think about the new world order, how we perceive aggression by one country or economic fallout of another and so forth?
So to answer that question, I'm going to do the very unconventional thing of starting with, just an incidental observation about what's going on right now. As we speak right now, I think it's just recently wrapped up. We've seen the TikTok hearings, okay, in the US Congress, where
I was basically
Representative of
nudging
TikTok
you
was
to
getting
go
grilled,
there.
by a committee that had made up their minds before going into the hearing. I mean, it was all just lots of grandstanding. I think the representative from TikTok was grandstanding, the congressmen were grandstanding, congresswomen are grandstanding. It's all good, it's all performative. And in many ways, you know what, TikTok is also performed. We are living in an era of what Roland Barthes terms, you know, this fetishization of the spectacle. I'm just paraphrasing here, right? This fetishization of the moment, the spectacle of arousal, where our attention as citizens, but also as consumers, and the lines are increasingly blurred there, as citizen consumers or consumer as citizens, our attention spans are closing in and are narrowing and are more compressed. Our ability to respond to profound and meaningful dialogue and conversations, or alternatively very long messages like the pieces I write, or the things I say, or this conversation here, are increasingly constricted by A, the acceleration of modernity, B, the compression of our subjective sensations of time as a result of modern technology. So this is what Hartmut Rosa terms or explores in his theory of social acceleration, right? But also C, the priming on our part, or the priming by surveillance technology and surveillance capitalism at large, to encourage us to reward us really for performing actions that are so mindless and yet come across as so meaningful at the same time, like clicking a button to express that we like something, like swiping left or right on Tinder or Grindr, like going on TikTok and reacting and imitating and lip syncing. I mean, these are all in many ways vacuous gestures, or could have been vacuous gestures 30 years ago, right? You go to someone who's never experienced Facebook before and say, hey, if you click this button, that means you really like this thing. He's like, what are you talking about, right? And yet all of these trivial gestures have been bestowed meaning by the contemporary era that we inhabit. Why? Because, and this is my hypothesis, this is an era where the signifiers chase. Okay, the signifiers chase what's being signified. The symbols have increasingly come to substitute and replace the actual reality. We live in a hyper reality where meaningless and vacuous acts like poking a screen and moving my fingers on a screen, left or right, or expressing this like, haha. By the way, I don't think we ever haha react to something. It's just haha, as almost like this tokenistic indication of humor, or that you're entertaining someone for that ostensible humor. All of these vacuous and meaningless gestures have suddenly been granted meaning, and yet such meaning is fleeting because it's built upon, you know, the recognition and acknowledgement of others within your community. That to me is what underpins as an ethos modern technology. Okay. It is this constant, insatiable thirst for others' interactions, participation, and recognition, and yet the fundamentally egocentric and egotistical drive that motivates that. When you put these two forces together, that is the era of social media. So the reason why I began with the TikTok hearings is I wanted to take a diss actually on the Congress. Yes, I do think there are problems with the way the hearings are being conducted, but I also think that the underlying problems are much wider than just TikTok or no TikTok. It's the way we consume media and consume involuntarily, subconsciously, information that in turn comes to shape our preferences, behavioral patterns, and actions and gestures, and you know what, beliefs. All right. So with that prelude set aside, there are three particular ways in which I see technology as intersecting this new era of communicative interactions and theories of communication. The first, of course, is news, right? Where historically news had always been something that was curated, carefully prepared, and disseminated by very control-driven and top-down outlets. So local presses, and then national presses, and then international and well-reputed presses. So that had been the primary modus operandi in media via which, or through which news had been disseminated up until the 1970s, 1980s, when we then saw, of course, the advent of television and then 24-hour television. But what uniquely characterized as commonalities both sets of media channels was that there was some degree of centralization and clear gatekeeping. Editors wouldn't let you post random things or write random things and get it published, even if you're Boris Johnson, on newspapers. Okay, maybe if you're Boris Johnson, you were given free pass. Anyway, sorry, Boris, Alexander. And yet, This gatekeeping and this tendency on the part of this more experienced and more well-trained journalists to help filter out misinformation, wrong information, a lot of this started breaking down around the time when social media first rose and cultivated a degree of momentum, right, and gravitas as this alternative source of news. And for the first time in human history, social media presented this unique, coagulation and enjoyment of A, vast dissemination and spread, okay? B, substantively, robust and rich information being communicated across the media, because it's 3D, it's 4D, it's visual, it's everything, right? It's everything everywhere all at once, literally. And thirdly, it's the high degree of synchronicity and simultaneity. You could be scrolling on your phone right now and see something that's happening in Sudan, literally as we speak. That never been possible prior to social media. You could lean into it for sure in a 24-hour television, yeah, but the 24-hour television wouldn't have the same level of mass density of information. And above all, it wouldn't have the fourth defining feature of the social media age of information dissemination, which is the lack of gatekeeping. Social media companies chase profits. They want to maximize the number of users and the volume of time they spend on the platform. Gatekeeping is inimical, at least in a sort of pre-Cambridge Analytica era and pre-Shoshana Zuboff era. It's inimical to corporate interests on the part of Facebook, Twitter, Google, and all these other big tech companies. So the first force I want to highlight here really is that our ability to sift truth or seek truth from facts, to paraphrase a sort of party apparatchik slogan, is indeed, hampered by the times that we're in, and also the displacing features that put us on a slippery slope where we're constantly trying to maintain our balance and keep our balance against the slippage of informational control and gatekeeping, and also at the end of the day, the shifting sands of truth. That's force number one. Second force, technology has also bred this inherent dependence that we have upon it, right? The reason why I'm worried about AI and the rise of it is threefold. The first is, of course, the relatively distant and yet hugely potentially detrimental possibility of AGI. The second is, the inequalities and inequities in access to technology, right? The classic have and have nots and so forth. But the third and arguably most primitive and primordial for fears and downsides of technology's advent is our potential of becoming too dependent upon it, upon AI, upon algorithms, upon data, upon laptops, right? Upon phones. Why do we like watching I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here so much? Not just because it's Matt Hancock, but it's instead because we all, deep down, in my view, right, I have a theory here, we all crave to see what would a world without the sort of, enfrailments and the attractions of modernity look like? What would that world look like, and how can we make sense of it? Why do we watch Man vs. Wild, for instance? Right? Why do we enjoy, Triangle of Sadness, especially okay, spoilers alert, but the second or the third, okay, the final third of the movie so much? Because we want to see what would happen if we were put once again in conditions where there's no technology. And I suspect, as many of these works would suggest as well, like Castaway, that the results would be pretty grim. Some of us might adapt, some of us could adjust, but most of us would struggle in a world without technology and communicative technology. So dependence is another trend I'm hugely worried. And I've been seeing this in my students as well, right? Where there's a lot of leaning into, oh, I'm going to use Grammarly to check my grammar. It doesn't work. I'm going to use ChatGPT to help me find my answers. I mean, good luck with that. Thank you very much for reading my day. I'm going to use, Facebook during class, right? Dependence is a real and dangerous phenomenon that we have to conquer. And I'm no prude. I'm not Luddite. I'm not saying that we ought to do away, with ChatGPT or other forms of AI altogether. Of course, inevitably, right? The more you crack down upon it, the more people will use it, the harder it is to indeed enforce these crackdowns. So I'm not a fan of saying let's not have ChatGPT in the classroom. But what I am saying is we've got to ask ourselves, beyond a certain point, why and how have we become so dependent upon technologies, all kinds of technologies? And this brings me on to the final point here. Technology it's not just a tool, nor is it just an ethos or philosophy, very high sounding. To me, it's a mindset. The definition of technological modernization is it's a mindset process. It's a mindset shift. It's not just about the means and the instruments that we wield control over. It's instead of how we see the world around us. And there's a few better examples than Pokemon Go in illustrating that, right? Prior to Pokemon Go, you'd go to a temple and think, oh, it's a temple. Great. Since the introduction of Pokemon Go, I've seen at least 13, 14-year-olds flock to temples, not to pray. It's instead because they want to catch that bloody Gyarados. Alternatively, that I don't know, that 5-star boss Pokemon, a Groudon, right? And I know this sounds a bit lame, but it's true. Augmented reality augments reality by not displacing reality, but by adding new additional layers to reality. And what I'd like you guys as audience members to think of, what I'm saying here, and to unpack this, is see the world around you as basically subtler forms of Pokemon Go, right? Take the life of a social media influencer. When they travel around a city that they're visiting, it's not just these scenic spots they're going to, they admire the catacombs, or they worship the Louvre, right, or the Jardins de Gelades. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. But another way of framing it is they're looking for places where they can snap selfies, with a phone. Selfie culture. Put it on Instagram. Sharing culture, right? Commercialization of privacy culture, or a culture that fetishizes the commercialization and exporting of one's private life, the blurring of the public-private lines. All of this is to say that, we are increasingly living in an era where the mindset shifts brought about by our access to technologies are not fully understood by ourselves, and yet so inculcated and deeply ingrained that we've become the prisoners, of technology. Not literally, right? Not in a Black Mirror sense, but in the terms of the mindset that when we wake up, the first thing we do is what? Is not open our eyes, is we reach our phones and say, I'm gonna check my messenger. Or what do folks use? Is it Snapchat, right? They open triple Snapchat. I don't use Snapchat for disclosure. That's a mindset shift. And that's also what I'm probably noticing in Gen Z folks, but also the alpha generation after them. And it was only when I realized the 2 generations after me, that's when I realized I'm actually quite old. The moment of epiphany struck me when I came to see myself and recognize that I am not indeed a part of Gen Z, nor am I a part of Alpha generation, but part of the generation that precedes millennials. So what can I say?
We get there. This is fascinating, Brian. Tell me a bit about your DPhil at Oxford. How did you decide your question? What was the process like? And where are you in your journey right now? What are some of the conclusions? And through through this question, I want to basically help our listeners understand, what does doing a PhD actually mean? What kind of rigor does it entail? What kind of changes and challenges that people go through? And what does the end result look like? Because I know that the focus of your DPhil, I think our audience members would enjoy it very much.
Absolutely. Well, look, I'm interested in questions of basically what do citizens owe in relation to one another, but also at large, when it comes to repairing the injustices perpetrated by the states. I'm looking specifically at the context of authoritarian regimes, okay? So that's essentially the thesis topic. The reason why I arrived at this topic is, the reasons really are threefold. The first is, we live in an era where authoritarianism is, according to some on the rise, according to others persisting, and according to some others still enduring. Like it or not, authoritarianism is real. It's a powerful phenomenon. We have to deal with it, right? We can't just say, oh, well, let's just wish it away, or alternatively, we love authoritarianism. I mean, one way or another, you like it, you don't like it, you still have to discover and unpack more about authoritarian regimes than there really is. And authoritarian regimes are heterogeneous, they're varied. There's some very competent authoritarian states. There's some also deeply, deeply perverse authoritarian states that have exported war and military aggression abroad. We've got to engage in the full spectrum. And the second reason is that most of Anglo-American political theory, at least over the past 30 to 40 years, had focused largely on so-called ideal conditions, and more specifically, idealized conditions that assume that the state they're operating in, or that theorists are theorizing about, are liberal democratic states, okay? Even John Rawls, who was very ambitious, even the very ambitious John Rawls in Law of Peoples only, said he wanted to deal with exclusively well-ordered peoples. Okay, so in other words, societies with broadly intact and functional conceptions of justice, and also sufficient stability as to render talk of justice actually a publicly valued exercise. I can think of many a country where that is not the case. I can think of many a country where you don't have well-ordered society per the John Rawls definition. So that's the second point. I want to expand. Okay, I want to expand our understanding, conceptions of, justice, and also theorization about justice beyond the very narrow, insights or assessments that we see in existing theoretical circles. Yeah, and that's also why, despite John Rawls's admirable "let's talk about well-ordered societies where people care about justice, institutions reflect the conceptions of justice, and both the people and the governors at large accept this set of stipulations," I want to take the world beyond that narrowly defined, or less narrowly defined in this case, circle, and say, what about the rest of the world? What about the 60% of people that live on planet Earth that don't reside in these societies, can be lumped into well-ordered or within that democratic and liberal democratic societies? And that ties me on to the final motivation. To me, theorization is always personal. Theorization is always about thinking about who I am and my situation and my situatedness and positionality, and asking, how can I make sense of who I am and make sense of the world through who I am, make sense of who I am through the world? So that's an active and constantly interpolated dialogue between the self and the world, between me and them, between I and others at large. And these are the three reasons why I fundamentally was drawn to this topic, and therefore opted to embark upon a PhD, and now in the final stages of wrapping up the DPhil. Yay. What can I say to those of you who are thinking about a PhD high audience members beyond saying, don't do it? Jokes aside, do it. Do it if you think you're looking for an opportunity to really push yourself to the frontier of human possibility. No, I'm just kidding. But if you want to stretch yourself, if you want to push yourself beyond your comfort zone, and most importantly, if you want to prove to the world that you are capable of being original, innovative, and in command and in control of a domain of knowledge, doing a PhD is amongst probably the best ways of doing so, of demonstrating that you possess the potency and capabilities in that regard. But I also don't want you to walk away thinking, I have to do a PhD, I'm going to do a PhD, I'm a failure. No, this is only one means amongst many. And there are many types of people out there, by the way, for whom this is not a means for the best path or the only path or the ideal path. This is only one means out of many for us who want to demonstrate to the world that we are original thinkers. I've known many an original thinker that did not do a PhD, or indeed a master's. I've also known many a PhD holder who's anything but original. I mean, they're as original as, a pack of crisps, which is not very original unless you're living in Britain, where each and every bag of crisps, in terms of the volume of air in it, really does strike you as original. Yes, they scam you. So what I want to highlight here is that doing a PhD is truly an ordeal. It is an arduous journey. It's not straightforward, not easy. There's no easy PhD unless you're talking about one of those degree mills, in which case, I mean, yes, I guess you get 10 PhDs. Me gusta, right? Classic me. But short of that, if you genuinely see yourself as having the energy, financial resources, and occupational need and professional desire and prerogative to pursue an intellectual exercise as strenuous as that, and all you ask yourself really is, do I really want it? I can't make up your mind for you, but I would say you should want it. You could want it, and you can succeed. So that's, I guess, my answer to your PhD question, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Thanks very much. And we ask this of all our guests, especially those who are pursuing a wide range of multimodal careers. What does a day in your life look like? How do you manage your energy, or how do you manage your time? When do you write? Give us a flavor of your day, your week, your month. And what, if anything, would you like to share with other people who might want to pursue multiple career paths?
I sleep around 6 hours a day. I wake up at 7 or so, go for a jog, go for or a swim, depending on the season. And then at 8 o'clock, I start my work day. Okay, so I usually put in 4 to 5 hours of solid work, writing, research, thinking, reading, very academic work. That takes me all the way up until midday, at which point I would have around 6 to 7 appointments, starting with a lunch appointment, and then around 5 to 6 coffees in the afternoon, timed not perfectly well, but broadly to time to ensure that I can maximize the number of folks I interact with, interlocute with, and have 5 to 6 meetings or 7 taking me up until mid-afternoon, at which point I would resume working again, whether it be on academic or non-academic consultancy work. That depends on entirely the demands and specifications of the task at hand, and also my workload and what I'm trying to juggle. And at around 7:30 to 8, I would then go to dinner. Again, whether it be in an appointment or just dinner with myself, depends on the exact circumstances, varies. But then at around 9 to 10, that's when my energy levels start dropping slightly. So I would go back and do something very exciting. I would start reading. I'd spend 2 hours reading from 10 to 12 usually. So I know I previously said in an interview that I did it from 12 to 2, but I'd recently changed my routine just to maximize the excitement in my life and the spice in my life. And then at midnight, I then spend another hour also wrapping up and tidying up loose ends in my work schedule and also my work progress, maybe dispatch emails, clear emails, touch base with friends and also colleagues. And at 1 o'clock, I'd head off to bed. So that's basically a typical routine for me each and every week for Monday to Saturday. And I normally in the worst months really, then take Sundays off. So that's my work routine. Now I'm conscious that I often get asked this question: what advice would I give to folks? And I'm conscious that I tend to say things along the lines of saying, "Oh, I can't give you good advice," blah blah blah. Okay, I'm going to try something new today because why not, right? Innovation. My advice to those who want to pursue multiple careers at once is this: you're not Superman. You're not Superwoman. You're not super whatever you are. You are a human. Christina Perry wrote a song, Human, where she said, "I'm only human and I crash and I fall down." And this is true. And what does that mean? That means, therefore, you've got to strategize and optimize. Your careers must have complementarity. Sure, you want to diversify. Sure, you want to maximize spread to some reasonable extent, but you can't afford, and you simply will not succeed if your multiple careers are so disjointed from one another that, I don't know, you're bouncing from being an engineer to becoming a top dog lawyer in the same day. I mean, you could try, you could aspire towards it. I'm sure there's some very brilliant folks that do that, but I would never, ever recommend that. Why? Because it's far too cognitively draining. And if you take me as an example, I'm a writer, I'm a consultant, I'm also an academic, but these jobs have more in common than people often think they do. And I pointed out some of these underlying commonalities already just then. No one, very few folks could do literally the most disjointed of things in multiples of 3 and still do them well. So be realistic. Be a slasher, sure. Be a polymath if you'd like to, if you aspire towards becoming one. Be someone who embraces multiple careers and pursues that to their own benefit and to the benefit of the world. Great. But remember, please remember, you need to be kind to yourself. I was watching Everything Everywhere All at Once, and there was this phrase, be kind, right? Because Alpha Wayman didn't know what was going on. So he said, be kind. Right? I know we all have our frustrations, but let's try and be kind to one another, like I am to Tan Mei, or Tan Mei not. So hi, Tan Mei. Okay, never mind. I like how there are people dropping in and out. It's a bit like Marvel multiverse and Marvel universe. We keep seeing these characters die and drop off, and then the new characters coming in are slightly worse. But anyway, that's a side point. So I hope that makes sense.
Oh, it does. It was. It's really important. I also tell people who ask me to manage your energy and really explore complementarities. Also, speaking with people, I noticed just like you, I also derive a lot of ideas, insights, debates, and discussions with people. Like we chat, you and I, in Oxford, and often have those conversations. So having that tribe of friends that you love to collaborate with, discuss with, is also something super useful. Brian, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or any final bit of advice or anything that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, I was hoping you'd ask me, actually, do you have any question for me, Brian? And I could sorely say, no, I thought you did a spectacular job. But if you were truly to ask me that question now, I would say, yes, I do have one question for you. So may I ask you that question?
Yes, let's do it.
What has been your favorite episode of this podcast series so far?
On Network Capital, the podcast, let me tell you privately, but I'll tell you some that I've enjoyed very much hosting. I have enjoyed hosting the former Pepsi CEO, Indra Nooyi, tremendously. I have enjoyed hosting and learned a ton from Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who you also hosted on Oxford Political Review. And there are, like literally every single person we invite on this particular episode does one or two things the absolute best in the world. And we invite young professionals such as yourself, senior executives, and in their peer group, according to my judgment and that of my team, they're at absolutely the top of the game, including yourself, Brian. We've been talking about it for a while. So in what you do, I think you've built your category of one.
Thank you so much for that. And I really like your answer there, in case I haven't made it clear. So thank you all for tuning in. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks very much.